The smell hit him first, a cloying sweetness buried under the sharp, metallic tang of coal dust that coated the back of his throat before he even knocked on the door. Webb adjusted his collar, the wool scratchy against skin, already raw from the damp chill seeping through his mackintosh. Onslow Square sat grey and sullen in the morning fog, its railings rusted into jagged teeth that matched the jagged line of Webb's own patience. He had walked 3 miles from the station because the buses were unreliable, and the underground felt too much like a tomb these days, pressing in on all sides with the weight of unfinished business. A woman opened the door before his knuckles could graze the wood again, her face a map of tight lines drawn by worry and the lack of proper sleep. "He isn't here," she said, the words tumbling out as if rehearsed for weeks while staring at the hallway runner. "I told the other gentleman yesterday. Mr. McSwan is away on business," she explained, likely in Brighton or perhaps France. Webb stepped inside without invitation, his boots leaving faint, wet prints on the parquet floor that the woman immediately tried to scrub away with the hem of her apron. "Which gentleman was that?" Webb asked, his voice low and measured, stripping away the rough edges of his London accent until only the flat precision remained. The woman flinched, her hands twisting the damp cloth until her knuckles turned the color of old bone. "Just a man asking questions, like you, said he was from the Board of Trade, but he didn't have a card and he smelled of vinegar." She looked up, eyes darting towards the staircase as if expecting someone to descend and rescue her from this interrogation. "Mrs. McSwan said not to worry. Donald sends letters. He's always been good at sending letters." Webb moved past her into the hall, the air inside thick with the scent of beeswax and something else, something faintly chemical that prickled the lining of his nose. It was not the smell of a home lived in. It was the smell of a place kept in suspended animation, waiting for a return that might never come. "May I see the letters?" "They're upstairs, in the study. But really, Inspector, if he's in Brighton, there's no need to disturb the papers. Donald hates it when things are moved." She led him up, her footsteps light and hurried, while Webb's heavy tread seemed to shake the very banister. The house felt hollow, the rooms stripped of personal clutter, every surface polished to a high, unnatural sheen that reflected the grey light from the windows in distorted shards. In the study, a silver tray sat on the desk, gleaming so brightly it hurt the eyes. The housekeeper began to polish it again, though it held no tarnish, her hand moving in a frantic, circular rhythm that spoke of a mind trying to scrub away a stain it could not see. "He stopped signing the book in November," Webb said, ignoring the polishing, his gaze fixed on the leather-bound ledger open on the side table. "Mid-month. The ink changes color after that, fainter, as if the pen was running dry or the hand was shaking." "Donald travels light," the woman muttered, her eyes fixed on the silver, the cloth whipping back and forth with a soft, rhythmic shhhshhh that grated against Webb's nerves. "He doesn't like to carry unnecessary weight, says it slows a man down." Webb leaned over the book, tracing the final entry with a gloved finger. November 14th. The signature looped confidently, but the date below it was scrawled, the digits uneven. After that, nothing, just blank pages waiting for a name that would not be written. "There is a cellar," Webb stated, turning away from the desk. "You mentioned a storage area for the coal." The woman stopped polishing. Her hand hovered over the tray, the cloth balled up in her fist like a wounded bird. "It's locked. We keep the ration cards down there, and the preserves, not much else. Coal is delivered to the chute outside." "I should like to see the preserves." It was not a request. Webb moved towards the door, forcing her to scuttle ahead of him, her slippers slapping softly against the stairs as she descended into the gloom of the lower ground floor. The air grew colder here, the chemical scent stronger, cutting through the smell of damp earth and old bricks. It smelled of acid, sharp and biting, the kind of odor that lingered in the sinuses long after the source was gone. She fumbled with a ring of keys, her fingers trembling so violently she dropped twice before finding the right one. The lock clicked with a sound like a breaking bone. Inside, the cellar was neat, almost obsessively so. Sacks of coal were stacked in perfect pyramids, jars of pickled onions lined up in military rows along the shelves, and the floor was swept clean of any dust or debris. Yet, in the corner, near the coal chute, a single sheet of paper lay crumpled against the skirting board, overlooked by the frantic cleaning. Webb crouched, his knees cracking in the silence, and picked it up. It was a page torn from a ledger, similar to the one upstairs, but this one was stained. A dark, oily patch spread across the bottom corner, translucent and greasy to the touch. He brought it closer to his face, inhaling sharply. The sweet-rot stench of sulfuric acid bloomed in his nostrils, undeniable and horrific. "What is that?" the woman asked, her voice thin, drifting from the top of the stairs where she refused to descend further. "Just old rubbish. I meant to burn it." Webb stood, folding the paper carefully and sliding it into his inner pocket, against the wool of his suit jacket, where it rested heavy against his ribs. "We shall need to take this for analysis," he said, his tone devoid of accusation, which seemed to frighten her more than anger would have. "And you will tell me the name of the man who visited yesterday, the one who smelled of vinegar." "I don't know his name," she whispered, backing away until her spine hit the cold brick of the hallway wall. "He just asked about Donald, said they were partners, said they were going to make something new together." Webb nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and turned back towards the stairs. The house felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in as the reality of the situation began to crystallize in his mind. This was not a simple disappearance. This was an erasure. He left the house without saying goodbye, stepping out into the fog which had thickened, swallowing the square in a blanket of grey wool. The walk back to the station was faster now, his stride lengthening as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift and lock into place. The oily stain in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a physical reminder of the chemical truth waiting to be uncovered. At the station, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the murmur of dozens of voices discussing trivial crimes that suddenly seemed insignificant. Webb sat at his desk, clearing a space among the piles of reports and ration books, and pulled out the train manifests for the southern region. He worked in silence, his eyes scanning the columns of names and destinations, looking for a pattern, a discrepancy, a lie. And there it was, hidden in the small print of a ticket issued on November 15th, the day after McSwan's last signature. A single fare to Crawley, purchased under the name John Gilbert. Webb tapped the paper with his pencil, the graphite leaving a small grey mark on the name. A porter at Victoria had mentioned a man fitting McSwan's description, travelling with a taller, smoother companion who did all the talking. The same companion who had visited the house in Onslow Square. A constable dropped a file onto Webb's desk, the thud breaking his concentration. "Message from the yard, sir, just came over the wire." Webb looked up, taking the slip of paper. It was terse, typed on thin carbon paper that smudged under his thumb. "A second disappearance has been reported, this one involving Archibald Henderson, who was last seen in the company of the same associate, confirming the pattern." Webb stared at the words, the letters swimming slightly before his tired eyes. The oily stain in his pocket seemed to pulse, a dark heartbeat sinking with the sudden, terrible realization that this was not a solitary tragedy, but a systematic harvest. He reached for his cigarette case, his fingers steady now, the weariness replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The ledger was opening, and the names were piling up faster than the ink could dry. The cigarette smoke in the room hung low, a yellow-grey ceiling that tasted of stale tobacco and the damp wool of rain-soaked overcoats clinging to the back of Webb's throat like a physical weight. He did not light the one he had pulled from the case. Instead, he rolled the unlit cylinder between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the dry paper crinkle under the pressure of a grip that refused to tremble. "Who found the Hendersons?" Webb asked, his voice cutting through the ambient murmur of the squad room without rising in volume. The constable, a young man whose face still held the softness of pre-war childhood, before rationing had sharpened every cheekbone in London, shifted his weight from one scuffed shoe to the other. "Mrs. Henderson's sister, sir, called it in an hour ago, said Archibald missed a meeting at the club, again, and his wife, Rose, hasn't been seen since Tuesday." Tuesday, Webb repeated the word, letting it sit on the tongue. It was the same day the porter at Victoria had spotted the tall, smooth man buying tickets for Crawley. The same day the oily residue on the ledger page in his pocket had likely still been wet. Did she say who they were meeting? She mentioned a business associate, a Mr. Haigh, said he was helping them with some property investments down in Sussex. Haigh, the name landed on the desk with the finality of a gavel strike, though no sound had been made. Webb wrote it down in his notebook, the nib of his fountain pen scratching harshly against the cheap, fibrous paper, ink bleeding slightly into the pulp where the quality had suffered under years of austerity. He underlined it once, hard enough to indent the page beneath. "Get me the file on McSwan," he ordered, standing up and buttoning his jacket over the hidden stain that seemed to radiate a phantom heat against his ribs. "And pull the records for any property transactions involving a Haigh in the Crawley area. We are not looking for buyers. We are looking for sellers who never collected their money." The constable hurried away, weaving through the maze of desks and filing cabinets that crowded the floor like gravestones in an overcrowded churchyard. Webb watched him go, then turned his gaze to the window. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the skeletal remains of a building bombed in 41, its brickwork exposed like raw meat against the grey sky. Reconstruction drills chattered in the distance, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that mocked the stillness of the dead. He walked to the filing cabinet, the metal cold under his palm, and dragged the drawer open with a shriek of protesting steel. Inside, folders were stacked haphazardly, labeled in fading ink with names that represented lives interrupted, families left waiting by telephone boxes, letters returned to sender. He found McSwan's file, thin and pathetic in its lack of substance, and placed it next to the new report on the Hendersons. Two men, both successful, both vanished into the same fog, guided by the same smooth-talking stranger. Webb sat back down, pulling the train manifest closer. John Gilbert, a name pulled from the air, generic and forgettable, designed to slip through the cracks of a bureaucracy overwhelmed by the sheer volume of post-war displacement. Haigh had not just stolen their money, he had stolen their identities, dissolving them into a chemical soup while he walked around wearing their lives like ill-fitting suits. The thought made his stomach turn, a sour lurch that had nothing to do with the cheap breakfast he had forced down earlier. He opened the McSwan file again, staring at the black-and-white photograph clipped to the front. A smiling man, confident, unaware that his future was already being measured out in gallons of acid. Webb traced the outline of the face with a grimy finger, wondering if McSwan had smelled the vinegar on Haigh's breath before the end, or if the deception had been so complete that death came as a surprise. "So," the constable was back, holding a thicker folder, the edges worn from handling. "Attempt 1, found something, sir, regarding the Crawley properties. There's a lock-up garage rented in the name of Haigh. The lease started 3 months ago, paid in cash. Critique, found something, sir, regarding the Crawley properties. Longer, there's a lock-up garage rented in the name of Haigh. Medium, the lease started 3 months ago." 3 months, Webb murmured, speaking before McSwan and before the Hendersons, yet his question cut through the silence. "Who owns the land?" "A Mr. Oliver, but he's not been seen either. His daughter reported him missing last week. We hadn't linked it yet, thought it was a separate domestic." Webb felt the air leave the room, sucked out by the sudden expansion of the horror. It was not a pattern, it was a list, a roll call of the consumed. He reached for his spectacles, taking them off to clean them with the frayed handkerchief in his pocket, the motion automatic, a ritual to buy time while his mind raced to catch up with the scale of the slaughter. "Oliver," he said, replacing the glasses and blinking against the smear of oil on the lens. "That makes 3, possibly 4 if we count the wife." "And the method, sir?" The sister mentioned Haigh talked about a new invention, something to do with preserving things. Webb's hand stopped midway to his cigarette case. Preserving, the word twisted in his mind, connecting with the oily stain, the sharp smell of sulphur, the meticulous neatness of the cellar where nothing was allowed to remain out of place. It was not preservation, it was disposal, a final, absolute erasure that left no body for the grieving to bury, no grave for the priests to bless. "Get me a car," Webb said, his voice dropping to a register that brooked no argument. "We are going to Crawley and bring a chemist, not a constable, but someone who knows what acid does to bone." The constable hesitated, his eyes widening slightly at the implication. "Sir, without a warrant, if this Haigh is just a businessman." "He is not a businessman," Webb snapped, the fatigue finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "He is a butcher who thinks he can cook the books along with the clients. Now move." As the constable scrambled to obey, Webb gathered the files, stacking them into a neat pile that hid the disordered truth within. He slid the stained ledger page from his pocket and placed it on top of the stack, the oily mark seeping slightly onto the clean white paper of the Henderson report. A contaminant, a signature. He walked out of the station into the cooling afternoon, the fog now retreating to the edges of the square like a tide going out, leaving the streets wet and glistening under the flickering gas lamps. The air smelled of coal dust and wet pavement, but beneath it, in his own memory, the sweet-trot scent of the cellar persisted, clinging to him as surely as the soot on his collar. The driver was waiting by the curb, the engine of the black Humber idling with a rough, uneven cough. Webb climbed into the back seat, the leather cold and cracked, and laid the files on his lap. He looked out the window as the car pulled away, watching the lights of London blur into streaks of amber and red. Somewhere in the darkening countryside, in a locked garage rented for cash, a drum waited. Inside it, perhaps, lay the remains of Donald McSwan, of Archibald and Rose Henderson, of William Oliver, dissolved, unmade, reduced to a sludge that could be poured down a drain or scattered in a garden. Webb closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the wheels on the wet road, a steady, hypnotic beat that counted down the miles to Crawley. He touched the pocket where the stained paper lay, feeling the rough texture of the evidence through the wool of his suit. "Drive faster," he said to the partition, his voice quiet but carrying an urgency that made the driver shift gears without question. "We have a date with a chemist." The car accelerated, leaving the safety of the city lights behind, plunging into the deep, unlit throat of the Sussex night, where the only truth left was chemical, and the dead waited silently for someone to speak their names again. The Humber's tires crunched over the grit of the Hampstead pavement, a sound like teeth grinding on bone, before the engine cut and the silence of the suburb rushed in to fill the void. Webb stepped out, his shoes sinking slightly into the damp moss that clung to the edge of the drive, and looked up at the house. It stood solid and unyielding, a brick fortress against the encroaching dark, yet the windows were blind, the curtains drawn tight against a world that had already moved on without the people inside. The air here was different from the station, thinner, sharper, carrying the heavy, cloying scent of boiling cabbage that had escaped through a cracked sash window 3 doors down, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of wet leaves. He did not knock immediately. Instead, he pressed his palm against the front door, feeling the vibration of a wireless set playing news of the Berlin airlift, the announcer's voice a muffled drone about tonnage and hope that seemed grotesquely out of place against the stillness of the hallway beyond. "Detective Inspector Webb," he called out, his voice flat, carrying no authority other than the weight of the badge in his pocket. "Open up, please. It concerns Archibald and Rose." The lock tumbled with a heavy clack, and the door swung inward to reveal a woman in her 50s, her face pale and drawn, the skin around her eyes tight with a sleepless kind of terror. She wore a cardigan that had been darned so many times the original wool was barely visible, replaced by a patchwork of mismatched grays and browns. "You're from the yard," she said, not a question but a statement of fact, stepping back to allow him entry. "I'm Mrs. Gable, Rose's sister. They said you might come. They said you'd tell us to stop worrying, that people go away sometimes." Webb removed his hat, holding it by the brim to keep his hands busy, and stepped into the hall. The warmth of the house hit him, thick with the smell of dust and old furniture polish, a preserved atmosphere that made his chest tighten. "We do not tell families to stop worrying when 2 people vanish without a trace, Mrs. Gable," Webb replied, his tone gentle but firm, avoiding the platitudes that usually served as a shield between police and public. "May we speak in the study, where they last were?" She nodded, leading him past a coat stand where a man's hat still hung, the felt crushed on one side as if dropped in haste. The study was small, dominated by a desk cluttered with papers, a half-eaten jar of rationed jam sitting precariously near the edge, the spoon resting inside as if the meal had been interrupted mid-swallow. Webb approached the desk, his eyes drawn immediately to the fountain pen lying uncapped beside the blotter. The ink had dried into a hard, black crust around the nib, a small, solidified testament to a departure that allowed no time for niceties. "He was here," Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling as she hovered in the doorway, unwilling to cross the threshold into the room that smelled so strongly of her brother-in-law's pipe tobacco. "Mr. Haigh. He came last Tuesday, said he had sorted the investments, that the market was too volatile for them to manage alone." Webb picked up a sheet of paper from the top of the stack, his fingers careful not to smudge the fresh ink. The signature of Archibald Henderson flowed across the bottom, elegant and looping, but something about the rhythm was wrong. The pressure was uniform, lacking the natural hesitation of a hand moving at speed, as if the pen had been guided by someone tracing a ghost rather than writing a name. "This signature," Webb murmured, holding the page up to the light of the desk lamp. "Did you see Mr. Henderson sign this?" "No, Archibald was. He was confused lately, for Rose said he trusted Mr. Haigh implicitly and called him a savior." Mrs. Gable wrapped her arms around herself, the cardigan pulling tight across her shoulders. "But the letters we got after they left didn't sound like them. The words were too stiff, like someone trying to wear another person's voice." Webb placed the paper back on the desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the blotter. The forgery was competent, enough to fool a bank clerk perhaps, but to a man who had spent years reading the lies of desperate men, it screamed of fabrication. It was the fluidity that gave it away. Real hesitation leaves a mark, a slight tear in the paper or a blob of ink, whereas this was smooth, too perfect, like a machine. "Did Mr. Haigh mention where they were going?" "Brighton was the story, I believe. He said they needed sun for Rose's nerves." Mrs. Gable stepped further into the room, her eyes fixing on the jar of jam. "She wouldn't leave that. She hated waste. Rationing made her obsessive about finishing every jar, every scrap. To leave it open, it would have driven her mad." Webb looked at the jam, the red surface already forming a skin where the air had touched it. A small domestic tragedy amidst the larger horror. He turned his attention to the window, looking out onto the garden where the shadows were lengthening, swallowing the flowerbeds whole. "There was a car," Mrs. Gable added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "a green Bentley that Mr. Haigh drove. He said it was theirs now, that Archibald had signed it over. But Archibald loved that car. Rain or shine, he polished it every Sunday morning so he wouldn't just give it away." "He didn't give it away, Mrs. Gable," Webb said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, for he knew the truth was far starker. He was relieved of it. He moved to the bookshelf, running a finger along the spines of the legal texts that lined the upper shelves. Dust motes danced in the beam of the lamp, swirling in a chaotic pattern that reminded him of the sludge in the cellar at Crawley. Everything here was ordered neat, preserved in amber, while outside, the world was crumbling into chaos. "I need to speak with anyone who might have seen them leave. Neighbors, the postman." "The postman comes at 10, Mrs. Gable said, noting that there's a pub, the King's Arms, on the corner. Mr. Henderson used to stop there for a shandy on his way to the station. The clerk there sees everything. He knows who comes and who goes." Webb nodded, making a mental note of the location. The timeline was tightening, the noose of evidence drawing closer around the man who called himself a savior. He thanked Mrs. Gable, promising nothing he could not deliver, and stepped back out into the cooling evening. The cabbage smell had intensified, now undercut by the acrid bite of coal smoke from a nearby chimney, a reminder of the city that churned on regardless of the silent houses within it. The King's Arms was dim, the air thick with the haze of cheap tobacco and the murmur of men discussing the football scores and the price of bread. Webb found the clerk behind the bar, a young man with a towel slung over his shoulder, wiping a glass with vigorous, circular motions. "Detective Inspector Webb," he announced, leaning against the bar with a casual ease that belied his intent. "I'm interested in last Tuesday, specifically around noon." Did you see a green Bentley outside, or perhaps a man matching the description of George Haigh? The clerk paused, holding the glass up to the light as he inspected it for a smudge. Haigh, yes, that one was a nasty piece of work, always in a hurry and never looking you in the eye. He set the glass down and leaned in, lowering his voice to say that Haigh had been arguing with someone near the station entrance. It looked like McSwan, that fella who went missing before, or maybe it was just someone who looked like him. Arguing, Webb pressed, his pulse quickening. About what? Money mostly, and shouting about accounts, but it wasn't a friendly row. Haigh had him by the arm, steering him towards a car that looked like he was forcing him into. The other fellow looked confused, maybe drunk, or perhaps just scared. Webb felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The witness account linked the two disappearances, bridging the gap between McSwan and the Hendersons with a single, violent thread. It was not a series of unconnected tragedies, it was a harvest. Did you see the car leave? Yes, headed south, towards Crawley, I'd guess, since that's the way the road runs. The clerk picked up the towel again, resuming his wiping. Didn't think much of it at the time, for people argue and people leave, yet I didn't know he was taking them to be erased. Webb thanked him and turned to leave, the noise of the pub fading behind him as he stepped back onto the street. The fog was rolling in again, thick and yellow, obscuring the streetlights and turning the world into a series offy double dotsy sedilla three shapes and shadows. He reached for his cigarette case, his fingers trembling slightly, but stopped himself. There would be time for smoke later. As he walked back to the Humber, a boy on a bicycle skidded to a halt beside him, breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion. Message for the detective, the boy gasped, handing over a telegram that was damp from the mist. Just came to the station, they chased me down. Webb took the paper, tearing it open under the glare of a street lamp. The words were stark, typed in the impersonal font of the telegraph office, yet they carried the weight of a verdict. Vehicle identified, a green Bentley whose registration matches the Henderson car, now located in a lock-up garage in Crawley and registered to Haigh. The sale documents are forged, awaiting instructions. He folded the telegram and slipped it into his pocket, the paper feeling heavy against his thigh. The garage in Crawley was not just a storage space, it was a tomb, a laboratory, a place where identities were dissolved into acid and sold for profit. He signaled the driver, the motion sharp and decisive. Crawley, Webb said, as he climbed into the back seat, adding that the chemist should meet them there, for they were done looking for the living. The car pulled away, the tires humming on the wet road, carrying them deeper into the night, where the only truth left was chemical, and the dead waited silently for someone to speak their names again. The fog closed in behind them, swallowing the lights of London, leaving only the dark road ahead and the terrible, certain knowledge of what waited in the dark. The Humber's tires did not hum, they slapped the wet tarmac, a rhythmic, wet cracking sound that matched the beating of Webb's own tired heart. Inside the cabin, the air grew stale, recycled through lungs that had breathed too much coal smoke and not enough oxygen for 3 days straight. The driver, a constable named Evans who smelled of wet wool and peppermint, kept his eyes fixed on the ribbon of road unfurling from the headlights, saying nothing. Good. Webb needed the silence to hold the telegram against his leg, feeling the damp paper soften as the heat from his thigh seeped into it. Crawley was not London. The city's grime gave way to a darker, heavier rural gloom, where the hedges seemed to lean in close to the road, trapping the mist in the ditches. No street lamps here, only the occasional farmhouse window glowing like a single, isolated eye in the blackness. The journey stretched, minutes elongating into hours, until the silhouette of the garage complex appeared on the left, a low brick scar against the night sky. "Stop here," Webb ordered, before the car had fully ceased its forward roll. He stepped out onto the gravel, the crunch loud in the stillness, and immediately the smell hit him. It was not the rot of a grave, nor the sweet decay of flesh left to nature. This was sharp, biting, a chemical acidity that clawed at the back of the throat and made the eyes water instantly. Sulphur. It hung low over the corrugated iron roof, a visible haze that shimmered under the moonlight. "Evans killed the engine. Smells like a factory, sir." It is a factory, Webb said, pulling his collar up against the stench. Of sorts. They approached the lockup, the beam of Webb's torch cutting a shaky path through the fog. The door was padlocked, a heavy iron thing that looked out of place on such a flimsy structure. Evans produced a set of cutters, the metal jaws gleaming, and with a sharp squeeze of his hands, the lock snapped. The sound was like a bone breaking. Webb pushed the door open. It groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a space that was meticulously, terrifyingly ordinary. There were stacks of old newspapers, a pile of empty sacks, and in the center, shrouded in a tarpaulin, a large metal drum. But it was the desk in the corner that drew Webb's attention. It was a cheap pine affair covered in papers. He moved to it, his torch beam dancing over the surface where invoices, receipts, and letters lay stacked, all signed by Archibald Henderson and all dated after the man had vanished. Webb picked up a fountain pen lying next to a ledger. Its nib was clogged with dried ink, a hard, black crust that suggested it had been dropped in haste and never retrieved. He uncapped it, sniffing the residual scent of iron gall ink, so mundane, so domestic. "Sir," Evans called from the center of the room, "you need to see this." Webb turned. The constable had pulled back the tarpaulin. Beneath it sat the drum, a 40-gallon vessel of galvanized steel. The lid was loose. Around the base of the drum on the concrete floor was a stain. It was not blood. Blood dries dark and flakes. This was a greasy, waxy residue, pale and translucent, clinging to the rough concrete like spilled fat that had cooled too quickly. Adipocere. The word surfaced from Webb's memory, a term from the textbooks he had studied during the war when the morgues were full and the earth was too hard to dig. Grave wax. "Do not touch it," Webb warned, his voice tight with urgency as he demanded the chemist be fetched immediately. "Now." Evans nodded, backing away as if the drum might leap at him. "What is it, sir? Is it them?" "It is what remains of them," Webb corrected, the distinction feeling vital, necessary, for Haigh did not just kill them, he unmade them. He returned to the desk, unable to look at the drum for more than a few seconds. The paperwork here was the real horror, a bill of sale for the green Bentley, signed by Archibald Henderson on a date when Archibald Henderson was already dust in this very room. The signature was fluent, elegant, the loops of the H sweeping with an artistic flair that Archibald, a man of blunt, practical hands, would never have possessed. It was too perfect, too fluid, like water flowing uphill. Webb traced the line of the signature with a gloved finger, feeling the indentation of the nib on the paper beneath. Forgery, cold, calculated theft of identity. Haigh had not only taken their lives, he had stolen their names, their assets, their very existence, and repackaged them for profit. The sheer audacity of it made Webb's stomach turn. A car engine roared in the distance, headlights sweeping across the garage entrance. The chemist, Fabian, would be close behind. The circus was arriving. Webb placed the pen back on the desk, aligning it perfectly parallel to the ledger's edge. A small act of order in a place of absolute dissolution. He looked at the drum again, the pale grease glistening in the torchlight. Somewhere in that sludge were the Hendersons. Somewhere in the acidic soup was Donald McSwan. Men who had walked, talked, loved, and worried about ration books, now reduced to a commodity to be poured down a drain. "The ledger," Webb said to the empty room, his voice sounding thin against the vast, silent weight of the crime. He kept a ledger of everything but the blood. He walked back to the entrance, stepping over the threshold into the cool, clean air of the night, though the smell of sulphur clung to his clothes, to his hair, to the very lining of his lungs. It would not wash out. He knew that now. Some stains do not fade with soap and water. Some soak into the bone. Fabian's car pulled up, the doors opening before the engine had fully stopped. The chief superintendent stepped out, his face grim, illuminated by the swirling fog. "Webb," Fabian said, skipping pleasantries, "is it true, the car?" "The car is here," Webb replied, gesturing to the shadowed interior where the Bentley sat like a sleeping beast. "And the owners are in the drum." Fabian paused, his hand hovering over his hat brim. "God help us." "He won't," Webb said, turning back to the garage, to the desk, to the forged signatures that screamed of a madness far more rational and terrible than any vampire myth. "We are on our own, Robert, and the evidence is waiting." He stepped back into the sulphurous haze, ready to begin the long, cold task of turning sludge into justice, of giving names back to the nameless, even if the cost was his own peace of mind. The night stretched ahead, endless and dark, but for the first time in days, Webb knew exactly where the path led. It led to the gallows. It led to the end. The mothball scent of stored wool rose in a thick cloud as Olive Durand-Deacon lifted the coat from the cedar chest, her fingers catching on the rough weave of the fabric. It was her best, a heavy tweed thing with a velvet collar that had survived the Blitz and the subsequent years of making do, mending, and wearing through to the lining. She shook it out, watching dust motes dance in the weak February light that filtered through the net curtains, and for a moment, the gesture felt like a rehearsal for a life returning to normalcy. Constance would need to look prosperous today. The meeting with Mr. Haigh was not merely a social call. It was the potential key to the workshop's survival, the promise of a new plastic molding process that could bypass the strictures on metal and restore the family name to the manufacturing roles. Olive smoothed a wrinkle from the sleeve, her mind skipping over the nagging unease her sister had voiced last night over tea, something about a strange smell clinging to Haigh's clothes, a sharpness that burnt the back of the throat. He said 2 o'clock sharp, Constance had remarked, stirring her rationed sugar into the weak brew, her spoon clinking against the china with a nervous rhythm. And he spoke of hunger, Olive, not for food but for success. It sounded hungry. Olive had dismissed it then, attributing the comment to the eccentricities of a man who lived alone in a workshop down in Crawley, far from the prying eyes of neighbors or the regulations of the trade boards. Men who worked with chemicals often smelled odd. Men who invented things often spoke in riddles. It was the price of progress. She fastened the top button of the coat, feeling the constriction around her neck, and checked her reflection in the hall mirror. The face looking back was tired, etched with the same lines of worry that marked every woman in London who had spent the last decade waiting for letters that never came or rationed books that arrived too late. But the coat looked good, solid, respectable. She stepped out onto the pavement, the cold air biting at her cheeks, and began the walk to the station. The streets were still scarred, gaps in the terrace rows filled with rubble and twisted rebar that looked like the exposed ribs of great beasts, but life was returning in patches. A boy kicked a tin can along the gutter. A woman pushed a pram with a wheel that squeaked in time with her stride. Normalcy or the illusion of it? Olive clutched her handbag tighter, feeling the leather strap dig into her palm. Inside was the sketch of the proposed mold, the calculations Constance had spent weeks refining, the hope that this meeting would be the turning point. She did not look back at the house. Looking back felt like inviting bad luck, and she had had enough of that to last a lifetime. The train to Crawley was crowded, the carriage smelling of damp wool and coal smoke, the windows fogged with the breath of commuters who stared blankly at the passing grey landscape. Olive stood near the door, swaying with the rhythm of the tracks, her mind drifting to the details Haigh had provided over the phone. He had been polite, excessively so, his voice smooth and cultivated, lacking the rough edges of the local tradesmen. He had spoken of his workshop as a sanctuary of innovation, a place where the old rules of scarcity did not apply. I can make something from nothing, he had said. I can dissolve the past and create the future. The phrase had struck her as odd at the time, a bit of theatrical flair, but now, rocking in the carriage, it echoed with a strange, dissonant weight. Dissolve the past. Was that not what they all wanted? To wash away the memories of the air raid shelters, the silence of the dinner table when a chair was empty, the endless queuing for scraps. When she arrived at the workshop, the building stood isolated at the end of a track of mud and broken brick, surrounded by a high fence topped with wire that glinted dully in the overcast sky. There were no signs of other workers, no hum of machinery, no clatter of tools, just silence, heavy and expectant. Olive pushed open the gate, the hinges groaning in protest, and walked towards the door. Before she could knock, it opened. Haigh stood there, smiling. He was a slight man, dressed in a suit that fit too well, as if tailored for a frame that had recently shrunk. His hands were clean, unnaturally so, the skin pale and soft, lacking the calluses of a man who worked with steel and fire. "Mrs. Durand-Deacon," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "Or is it Miss? Do forgive me, the records are so often confused." "Mrs. Fine," Olive replied, stepping into the hallway. The air inside was wrong. It carried a sharp, vinegary tang that strung her nostrils and made her eyes water slightly. It was not the smell of oil or coal or the usual industrial reek of the workshops she knew. It was acidic, biting like vinegar left to rot in a closed room. She coughed, covering her mouth with a gloved hand. "It smells strong in here. Are you working with solvents?" "Acids," Haigh corrected gently, closing the door behind her until the latch clicked with a finality that made her jump. "Sulfuric, essential for the process, you see, as it cleanses by removing the impurities. One must be thorough." He led her through the main room, which was surprisingly tidy. Benches were clear, tools arranged in precise rows, not a speck of grease on the floor. It looked less like a factory and more like a laboratory or perhaps a surgery. Olive kept her coat buttoned, her arms crossed over her chest, as if to hold herself together against the creeping chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Haigh talked as they walked, his voice a low, steady drone that filled the silent spaces. He spoke of his time in France, of a man named Sarret who had understood the true nature of identity, how it could be transferred, absorbed. He spoke of hunger again, that same word Constance had noted, but now it sounded different, less metaphorical, more physical. "The body is merely a vessel," Haigh said, stopping before a heavy wooden door at the rear of the workshop. He placed his hand on the knob, turning it slowly. "Once the spirit has moved on, the shell is of no use. Waste, really. Why let it clutter the earth when it can be utilized, recycled?" Olive frowned, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Constance mentioned a mold for the plastic casing. "Attempt 1. "Indeed," Haigh said as he pushed the door open. "The mold is inside, but first, you must see the bath." He gestured for her to enter. Inside the small shed, the smell was overwhelming, a choking cloud of acrid vapor that made her breath catch in her throat. In the center of the room stood a large drum, galvanized steel, sitting on a low brick plinth. The lid was off. Steam rose from the opening, curling in lazy ribbons towards the low ceiling. Olive took a step forward, her shoe scraping against the concrete floor, and peered over the rim. The liquid inside was dark, churning slightly, bubbling with a slow, viscous energy. It did not look like water. It looked thick, oily, alive. "It is ready," Haigh said, his voice dropping an octave to shed its polite edge. As he moved closer, his shadow fell over her and blocked the light from the doorway. "Your sister understood, eventually, for she saw the necessity of it. The hunger must be fed, Olive, not just with ideas, but with substance." Olive turned, her heart hammering against her ribs, the instinct to run firing through her limbs, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The vinegary smell was in her lungs now, burning, stripping away her ability to think, to speak. Haigh smiled, and for the first time she saw the emptiness behind his eyes, the absolute lack of humanity that had been masked by the suit and the smooth voice. He reached out, his clean, pale hand grasping her arm. "Come," he whispered, "it is time to be unmade." The world tilted, the shed spun, and then there was only the acid, the heat, and the terrible, silent dissolution of a name. The rain in London did not wash things clean, it merely drove the soot deeper into the stone, turning the city into a uniform shade of grief-stricken grey. Detective Inspector Albert Webb sat at his desk, the pile of missing persons reports before him growing like a malignant tumor. He rubbed his temples, the skin there feeling tight and hot. Another family, another woman gone. "She went to see him," Olive Durand-Deacon said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a furious, barely contained rage. She stood on the other side of the desk, her hands gripping the edge of the wood until her knuckles turned white. "Constance told me she was meeting Haigh at his workshop in Crawley, and now she is gone, vanished like smoke." Webb looked up, meeting her gaze. He saw the same desperate hope he had seen in hundreds of other eyes, the need for an answer, any answer, even a terrible one. "We are making inquiries, Mrs. Durand-Deacon. Mr. Haigh is known to us. We have spoken to him regarding previous disappearances." "Previous?" Olive's voice cracked. When she asked if he knew the man was involved, if he knew he was a killer, her words tumbled into a frantic demand. Why was he not in a cell? Why sit here shuffling papers while he remained out there, breathing the same air as the rest of us? "Because evidence is not suspicion," Webb said quietly, reaching for his spectacles to clean them, a reflex he could not suppress. "We need proof, not rumors, not smells. It smelled of death in that place, Olive insisted, leaning forward with a face pale and drawn. Vinegar and death, I could feel it, just as Constance did when she told me she was afraid. And now she is gone. If you do not act, Inspector, if you do not arrest him today, who will be next? Me, my brother. Webb paused, the cloth hovering over the lens. He thought of the drum in the Crawley garage, the greasy residue on the floor, the forged signatures that danced across the ledgers like ghosts. He thought of the chemical analysis pending, the slow, agonizing wait for the lab to confirm what his gut already screamed. We will act, Webb said, his voice hardening, the weariness momentarily eclipsed by a cold, sharp resolve. But we must be sure. For Constance's sake, we must be sure. Olive stared at him for a long moment, then straightened her coat, the movement sharp and defiant. If she is dead, Inspector, I want his head. Do not bring me excuses. Bring me justice. She turned and walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind her. Webb watched her go, then looked down at the file on his desk. Durand Deacon, Constance. He opened it, adding a fresh sheet of paper. The ink was still wet. The ledger was growing. And somewhere in Crawley, the acid was still eating. The train shuddered to a halt on the wet tracks, releasing a cloud of steam that hung low over the Crawley platform like a held breath. Constance Durand Deacon stepped down onto the pavement, the hem of her coat brushing against the grimy edge of the platform where cold dust had settled into the concrete cracks. She adjusted her gloves, woolen and thin against the February chill, and checked the time on her wristwatch. 2:30. Haigh was precise, or so his letters claimed. Precision suggested reliability, and reliability was something the Durand Deacon family desperately needed after the losses of the war. She walked from the station towards the industrial estate, her shoes clicking on the wet pavement. The air here tasted different than in London, less coal smoke, more earth and chemical runoff. She found the workshop easily enough, a corrugated iron structure tucked behind a row of locked garages. The paint was peeling, revealing rust beneath like old scabs. Constance paused at the gate, hesitating for a fraction of a second before lifting the latch. The metal was cold, biting through her glove. Haigh opened the door before she could knock. He wore a suit that fit too well, the fabric smooth and dark, untouched by the rationing that thinned the elbows of most men. He smiled, an expression that reached his eyes but did not warm them. "Mrs. Durand Deacon," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. "Punctuality is the courtesy of kings, or so I am told." "Mr. Haigh," Constance replied, moving into the workshop. The space was cluttered with machinery, lathes and presses sitting silent under a layer of grease, but beneath the oil lay another scent, sharp and stinging at the back of the throat. Vinegar, no, stronger, acid. She glanced at the barrels lined against the far wall, labeled with chemical warnings she did not fully recognize. "You mentioned a mold for the plastic casing." "I did," Haigh said, closing the door behind her until the latch clicked with a finality that echoed in the large room. "But the mold is only part of the process, for one must understand the preparation. The raw material must be stripped before it can be reshaped. It is a chemical necessity." He walked past her towards a smaller door at the rear of the workshop. Constance followed, her footsteps muffled by the sawdust scattered on the floor. The smell intensified as they approached the rear shed, cloying and sweet rot sticking to the inside of her nose. She stopped at the threshold, her hand resting on the doorframe. "It is cold in here," she said, though the shed was warmer than the workshop. "Heat is required," Haigh said, turning to face her. He stood between her and the large galvanized drum sitting on the brick plinth. Steam rose from the open lid, curling in lazy ribbons towards the low ceiling, for the reaction to take place, for the transformation. Constance looked at the drum. The liquid inside was dark, churning slightly, bubbling with a slow, viscous energy. It did not look like water. It looked thick, oily, alive. She took a step forward, drawn by a morbid curiosity she could not suppress. "What is in it?" "Essence," Haigh said, his voice dropping an octave to shed its polite edge. "Waste removed, value retained. Eventually, your sister understood the concept. She saw the necessity of it." Constance froze. The air in the shed felt heavy, pressing against her chest. "My sister, Olive, she has not been here." "Not Olive," Haigh corrected, moving closer. His shadow fell over her, blocking the light from the doorway. "Constance, you." She turned, the instinct to run firing through her limbs, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The vinegary smell was in her lungs now, burning, stripping away her ability to think. Haigh smiled, and for the first time she saw the emptiness behind his eyes, the absolute lack of humanity that had been masked by the suit and the smooth voice. He reached out, his clean, pale hand grasping her arm. His grip was iron. "There is no pain," he whispered, guiding her towards the rim, "only unmaking." The world tilted, the shed spun, and then there was only the acid, the heat, and the terrible, silent dissolution of a name. Rain in London did not wash things clean, it merely drove the soot deeper into the stone, turning the city into a uniform shade of grief-stricken grey. Detective Inspector Albert Webb sat at his desk, the pile of missing persons reports before him growing like a malignant tumor. He rubbed his temples, the skin there feeling tight and hot. Another family, another woman gone. "She went to see him," Olive Durand-Deacon said, her voice trembling not with fear but with a furious, barely contained rage. Standing on the other side of the desk, she gripped the edge of the wood until her knuckles turned white. "Constance told me she was meeting Haigh at his workshop in Crawley, and now she is gone, vanished like smoke." Webb looked up, meeting her gaze. He saw the same desperate hope he had seen in hundreds of other eyes, the need for an answer, any answer, even a terrible one. "We are making inquiries, Mrs. Durand-Deacon. Mr. Haigh is known to us. We have spoken to him regarding previous disappearances." "Previous?" Olive's voice cracked. "You know he is involved. You know he is a killer. So why is he not in a cell? Why are you sitting here shuffling papers while he is out there, breathing the same air as the rest of us?" "Because evidence is not suspicion," Webb said quietly, reaching for his spectacles to clean them, a reflex he could not suppress. "We need proof, not rumors, not smells." "It smelled of death in that place," Olive insisted, leaning forward with a face pale and drawn, whispering of vinegar and death. She could feel it, and so could Constance, who had confessed her fear before vanishing entirely. "Now she is gone. If you do not act, Inspector, or arrest him today, who will be next? Me, my brother." Webb paused, the cloth hovering over the lens. He thought of the drum in the Crawley garage, the greasy residue on the floor, the forged signatures that danced across the ledgers like ghosts. He thought of the chemical analysis pending, the slow, agonizing wait for the lab to confirm what his gut already screamed. "We will act," Webb said, his voice hardening, the weariness momentarily eclipsed by a cold, sharp resolve. "But we must be sure. For Constance's sake, we must be sure." Olive stared at him for a long moment, then straightened her coat, the movement sharp and defiant. "If she is dead, Inspector, I want his head. Do not bring me excuses. Bring me justice." She turned and walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind her. Webb watched her go, then looked down at the file on his desk. Durand-Deacon, Constance. He opened it, adding a fresh sheet of paper. The ink was still wet, the ledger was growing, and somewhere in Crawley, the acid was still eating. The match flared. Sulphur bit the air, sharp and immediate, joining the stale tobacco smoke that already hung low over the table like a grey ceiling. George Haigh held the flame steady, his hand devoid of tremor, and brought the fire to the tip of the cigarette with the precision of a surgeon tying a knot. He inhaled. The ember glowed orange, receding as the smoke filled his lungs, then exhaled in a slow, controlled stream that drifted towards the single bare bulb swinging gently above them. Detective Chief Superintendent Fabian sat opposite, elbows on the scratched wood, fingers steepled under his chin. He did not blink. "You claim sustenance," Fabian said. His voice was flat, stripped of curiosity. "You claim you drank them." "Blood is life," Haigh replied. He tapped ash into a saucer that had been pushed to the edge of the table, neglecting the ashtray provided. "Without it, I wither. It was not murder, Superintendent. It was a necessity, a biological imperative you might find difficult to comprehend given your robust constitution." Webb stood in the corner, pressed against the peeling paint of the wall where the shadows gathered thickest. He kept his hands in his pockets, fingers brushing the lint and loose change there, grounding himself against the absurdity pouring from the suspect's mouth. The room was small, boxed in by brick and bureaucracy, smelling of damp wool and the sharp tang of disinfectant used on the floorboards that morning. Outside, a lorry backed up somewhere in the yard, beeping rhythmically, a mechanical counterpoint to the delusion unfolding under the light. Haigh leaned forward, the cigarette balanced between forefinger and thumb. He wore a suit that fit too well, the lapels sharp, the tie knotted with geometric perfection. There was no stain on the cuff, no grease under the nail. A man who dissolved bodies in acid should have carried the scent of the chemical on his skin, a lingering vinegar, rot that no soap could shift, yet he smelled only of lavender water and expensive tobacco. "Where are the bodies, Haigh?" Fabian asked, his voice remaining low even as the question landed heavy, like a stone dropped into a well. "You say they are gone, unmade, yet you speak of their blood as if it were wine." "The flesh is irrelevant," Haigh said, waving the cigarette to leave a trail of grey smoke that twisted in the still air. "It is the vessel, for I required the essence." The Hendersons understood, eventually, though McSwan less so. He was loud, and noise attracts attention. "I prefer quiet." Webb watched the man's throat work as he swallowed. It was a normal motion, human. There was no fang, no madness in the eye, only a cold, calculating intelligence that had constructed a fortress of nonsense to hide behind. The vampirism story was a shield crafted not from superstition, but from legal strategy. If the mind was unsound, the gallows remained out of reach. Webb knew the game. He had seen killers plead insanity over lesser crimes, men who snapped under the weight of a stolen loaf, let alone 6 lives extinguished in a garage in Crawley. Fabian shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under the weight of his frustration. "We are not discussing your dietary requirements. We are discussing 6 people who walked into your workshop and never walked out. You expect this court to believe you consumed them all." "I consumed what was necessary," Haigh corrected, his tone polite and almost instructional, as if he were correcting a junior clerk on a filing error. "The rest was dealt with efficiently. There is no evidence, Superintendent, and you will find nothing, only clean drums and empty space." Webb pushed off the wall. The movement was slight, a shift of weight from one foot to the other, but it drew Haigh's eye. The suspect turned his head, looking at Webb with a faint smile playing on his lips, acknowledging the observer in the shadows. "Inspector Webb," Haigh said, "you look tired. The burden of proof is a heavy thing, is it not, to chase ghosts while the real work goes on elsewhere?" "The work is finding the truth," Webb said, keeping his voice low to match the quiet hum of the room, "not listening to stories." "Truth is malleable," Haigh murmured. He took another drag, holding the smoke inside for a count of 3 before releasing it. "What you call truth, I call survival. In a world of rationing and scarcity, I found a way to thrive. Is that not the British way? To make do, to improvise?" Fabian slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking like a pistol shot that made the saucer jump. Ash scattered across the paperwork, grey dust settling on the typed statements. "Do not philosophize with me. You are a murderer, a common thief who hid behind a fountain pen and a false name, for there is no nobility in acid." Haigh did not flinch, merely looking down at the scattered ash before raising his eyes to Fabian with an expression of mild disappointment. "Anger clouds judgment, Chief Superintendent. It leads to mistakes, yet he had made none. The chemistry is sound, and the process is complete." Webb stepped out of the corner. He walked to the table, placing a hand on the back of the empty chair beside Fabian. The wood was cold under his palm. He looked at Haigh, really looked at him, searching for the crack in the armor, the slip that would reveal the man beneath the monster. There was only the suit, the cigarette, the calm, dry eyes that reflected the bulb above without warmth. "You say there is no evidence," Webb said, "yet you drew us a map and led us to the workshop." "Cooperation is virtuous," Haigh said. He crushed the cigarette out, twisting the butt into the saucer until the ember died. "I wish to clear the air. There is so much confusion in the world. I aim to simplify." "Simplify," Fabian repeated, the word tasting foul in his mouth as he added, "You dissolved human beings, and you call it simplification." "I removed the clutter," Haigh said. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, the picture of a man satisfied with a job well done. "What remains is the estate, the assets, the legacy, Surely you care about the legacy, Inspector. It is all that lasts. Webb felt a tightness in his chest, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the man's arrogance. It was a physical pressure, pressing against his ribs, making breath shallow. He thought of Olive Duran-Deacon standing in his office, her knuckles white on the desk, demanding justice for a sister reduced to sludge. He thought of the lab reports waiting on his own desk in London, the chemical analysis that would speak louder than any confession of blood drinking. The legacy is a rope, Webb said, his voice remaining low because he did not need to raise it, and it waits for you at Pentonville. Haigh smiled. It was a thin expression, stretching the skin tight over his teeth, devoid of humor. Then I shall drink deeply before I go. Fabian stood up, pushing his chair back with a screech of metal on linoleum. He gathered the papers, shuffling them into a messy pile, ignoring the ash scattered across the top. We are done here, take him back. Two uniformed officers moved in from the door, hands gripping Haigh's arms. Haigh stood without resistance, smoothing his lapels before allowing them to guide him towards the exit. He paused at the threshold, looking back at Webb one last time. Check the drum, Haigh said softly, warning that one should not expect bones because they are stubborn and take time. The door closed, the latch clicked. Silence rushed back into the room, filling the space where the voice had been. Fabian remained standing, staring at the closed door, his hands resting on the table as if he needed the support to stay upright. Webb walked to the window. The glass was dirty, smeared with rain and grime, obscuring the view of the yard below. He could see the vague shapes of men moving down there, loading crates, smoking, living lives untouched by the horror in the room. He turned back to Fabian. He wants the insanity plea, Webb said. He wants the headlines. He wants to be a monster so he does not have to be a murderer. Fabian nodded, wiping ash from his sleeve as he said, let him talk. Let him tell the papers he drank them dry, for it does not matter what he says. No, Webb agreed. He walked to the table and picked up the saucer, holding the crushed cigarette butt in the center. It smelled of burnt tobacco and something sweeter, cloying like rotting fruit. It does not matter. The acid does not lie. The fat does not lie. He placed the saucer back down. The metal rang against the wood. Get the warrant for Crawley, Webb said. We ignore the blood. We ignore the vampires. We go for the gallstones. Fabian looked at him, a flicker of respect crossing his weary face. Gallstones. They survive, Webb said. He moved towards the door, his hand on the latch. Bone dissolves, flesh melts, but the stones remain, hard little facts in a sea of sludge. He opened the door to find the corridor outside dim, its lights flickering overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a telephone rang, shrill and demanding. Webb stepped out into the light, leaving the smoke and the lies behind him because the real work was waiting at the workshop. The fog did not roll, it pressed, a damp wool blanket smothering the street lamps until the glow was nothing more than a bruised smear on the wet pavement. Webb stepped out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him with a finality that felt less like metal meeting frame and more like a judge's gavel striking wood. Cold air hit his face, carrying the familiar London cocktail of river mud, unburnt coal, and the faint, cloying sweetness of rotting cabbage from a nearby market stall. But beneath it all, he could still smell the acid. It was phantom scent, he knew, a trick of the mind born from hours spent leaning over Simpson's glass dishes, yet it clung to the inside of his nostrils, sharp and metallic, as if the vapors had seeped into the very lining of his sinuses. A camera flash erupted, blinding white against the gloom, turning the night into a split-second negative where shadows stood out stark and bone-white. Detective, is it true he drank them? Did you find bones, sir? Any bones at all? The voices came from the dark, a pack of hyenas sensing the kill before the body was even cold, their notebooks already open, pencils poised like daggers. Webb kept walking, his collar turned up against the drizzle, ignoring the scramble of feet on the wet stones as the press surged forward, desperate for a quote that would sell papers in the morning. He said nothing. To speak now would be to feed the beast, to give Haigh the stage he craved, the spotlight where he could spin his tales of blood and vampirism until the truth was obscured by folklore. He reached the Black Humber, the paint dull under the streetlight, and yanked the door handle. The metal was cold, biting into his palm. "Get in, sir," the driver asked, not turning, his voice muffled by the glass partition. "Drive," Webb said, sliding onto the back seat. "Yard, then home." The car pulled away, leaving the shouts behind, the engine humming a low, steady note that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of Webb's shoes. He leaned back, the leather upholstery creaking under his weight, and closed his eyes. The charge sheet rested in his inner pocket, a hard rectangle against his ribs, heavier than the paper warranted, weighted by the precedent it set. No body, no grave, just fat, stones, and a piece of plastic that had once held teeth in a dead woman's mouth. It felt flimsy, a house of cards built on a foundation of chemistry, yet Simpson's voice echoed in the quiet of the cabin, steady and unyielding. "The chemistry does not lie." Webb opened his eyes, looking out at the passing city. The blitz scars were still there, gaps in the terrace rows where brick and mortar had been blown into dust, now filled with rubble or temporary prefabs that looked like tin cans dropped by a careless giant. People huddled in doorways, waiting for buses that might not come, their faces gray in the streetlight, wrapped in coats that had been patched and repatched until the original fabric was a memory. They did not know about the gallstones. They did not know that a man could be hanged for a murder where the victim existed only as a greasy residue in a drum. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the folded paper. "Stop," he said suddenly. The driver braked, the car lurching slightly before settling. "Sir." "Wait here." Webb opened the door and stepped out onto the pavement, the damp chill seeping instantly through his shoes. He walked a few paces to a lamppost, the light flickering above him with a buzzing insect sound, and pulled the charge sheet from his pocket. He unfolded it, the paper crisp and white against the grime of the night. "Murder." The word stared back, black and absolute. He ran a thumb over the ink, still slightly tacky despite the drying time, feeling the raised ridge of the letters. This was it. The thing that would hang George Haigh. Not a witness who saw him strike a blow, not a weapon stained with blood, but science. Pure, cold, unfeeling science. A woman passed him, pulling a pram with a squeaky wheel, her head down against the wind. She glanced at him, saw the suit, the official posture, and quickened her pace, crossing the road to avoid him. In this city, a man standing alone under a lamp reading papers at this hour was either a policeman or a troublemaker, and neither was welcome. Webb refolded the sheet, tucking it away again. The phantom smell of sulphur was fading, replaced by the exhaust fumes of his own car, but the feeling of contamination remained. He had spent so long in the world of the dissolved, the erased, that the solid world felt temporary, fragile. Haigh had believed he could erase people, turn them into nothing more than a few bubbles of gas and a layer of sludge. And for a moment, looking at the empty spaces in the terrace rows, Webb wondered if the killer had been right about the fragility of life, if not about the impossibility of proof. He returned to the car, the door closing with a solid thud that shut out the noise of the street. "Home, sir?" the driver asked again. "Yes," Webb said, leaning forward to tap the glass partition. "And Thomas, take the long way, via Crawley." "Crawley, sir? It's well out of our way, and the roads will be poor this time of night." "Do it." The car moved off again, merging into the sparse traffic. Webb watched the city slide by, the shops boarded up, the cinemas dark, the rationing notices still plastered on walls where recruitment posters had once demanded men for the front. He thought of Olive Duran-Deacon, sitting in her house with a sister gone and an estate in limbo, waiting for a verdict that would bring no comfort, only a grim closure. He thought of the Hendersons, of McSwan, their names now attached to a legal theory rather than a grave marker. The journey stretched out, the miles ticking by on the odometer, until the familiar skyline of London gave way to the darker, rural outline of Sussex. The air changed, becoming sharper, cleaner, stripped of the coal smoke that hung over the capital. When they finally turned onto the lane leading to the workshop at Crawley, the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the corrugated iron shed where the drum had been found. "Stop here," Webb said. He got out, the silence of the countryside wrapping around him, heavy and absolute. No shouting reporters, no humming traffic, just the wind rustling the dry grass and the distant hoot of an owl. He walked towards the shed, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The police tape fluttered in the breeze, a ragged ribbon of white in the beam of the torch he had taken from the car. He lifted it, ducking under, and stepped inside. The smell hit him first, real this time, not a phantom. Sulfuric acid, sharp and choking, mixed with the damp earthiness of the floor. The drum was gone, removed to the laboratory, but the stain remained on the concrete, a dark, greasy patch that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove. Webb shone the torch on it, the light dancing over the rough surface. Here, a woman had ceased to be a person and become evidence. Here, the law had to reinvent itself to catch a killer who thought he was above the old rules. Webb knelt, his knee cracking in the silence, and touched the stain. It was dry, cold. "You didn't win," he whispered to the empty room, his voice sounding small against the corrugated walls. "You just made it harder for the rest of us." He stood up, brushing the dust from his trousers, and turned to leave. The torch beam swept across the far wall, catching something glinting in the corner, a small, forgotten shard of metal, or perhaps just a reflection of the light on a wet patch. But for a second, it looked like a tooth, lying in wait, ready to speak its truth to anyone who knew how to listen. Webb froze, the breath catching in his throat. Then he shook his head, dismissing the trick of the light, and walked out into the night, leaving the shed to its ghosts and the coming dawn. The car waited, engine idling, ready to take him back to the world of men, where justice was messy, imperfect, and finally, undeniably done. The air inside the Old Bailey did not circulate. It stagnated, a heavy broth of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the nervous sweat of 300 people crushed into a space meant for half that number. Webb stood near the back, his spine pressed against the cold paneling, watching Haigh take the stand. The prisoner moved with a peculiar, liquid grace, adjusting his spectacles as if he were settling into a club armchair rather than facing the gallows. He spoke of blood, of a thirst that transcended mere murder, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence, designed to hypnotize the jury into believing they were witnessing a tragic madness rather than a calculated fraud. "Is it not possible," Haigh asked, turning his head slightly to catch the light from the high windows, "that the soul requires a sustenance the body cannot provide?" A murmur rippled through the gallery, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. Webb felt a sharp tug of irritation in his chest, a physical reaction to the theatricality of it all. This was not a confession, it was a performance, a desperate attempt to wrap the sordid reality of greed in the velvet cloak of the supernatural. Haigh wanted to be a vampire because a monster could be studied, pitied, perhaps even locked away in an asylum, whereas a common thief who killed for insurance money could only hang. The judge shifted in his high seat, the silk of his robes rustling like a warning. "Mr. Haigh, we are concerned with facts, not folklore. Please confine your answers to the events of August." "But the event was the drinking, my lord," Haigh insisted, his eyes widening with a feigned earnestness that made Webb's fingers twitch towards the notebook in his pocket. "The rest was merely cleanup." Webb closed his eyes for a second, blocking out the spectacle. He could smell the acid again, not in the room, but in his memory, that cloying, sweet-rot stench that had clung to the back of his throat since Crawley. It was a smell that denuded poetry. It denuded souls. It reduced a human being to adipocere and sludge, and no amount of dramatic posturing could change the chemical reality of what had happened in that shed. Then the atmosphere shifted. The prosecution rose, and Dr. Simpson was called forward. The pathologist moved with a different kind of gravity, a man burdened by the weight of things seen and measured rather than imagined. He carried a small box, plain and unadorned, which he placed on the rail with a soft thud that seemed to silence the entire court more effectively than the judge's gavel. "Dr. Simpson," the prosecutor began, his voice dry, devoid of any attempt at drama, "you examined the contents of the tank found at Mr. Haigh's workshop. What did you find?" Simpson did not look at Haigh. He looked at the jury, his expression one of weary professionalism. "I found human fat," he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a well. "Specifically, adipocere formed from the subcutaneous tissue of a female subject, and I found gallstones." Haigh shifted on the stand, the first crack in his composure appearing as a slight tightening of the jaw. Gallstones, the prosecutor repeated, ensuring the word landed heavily. Yes, 3 of them. And crucially, Simpson paused, reaching into the box to withdraw a small pinkish object encased in glass. I found this. He held it up, a denture plate, partial, with a single gold tooth catching the dim light of the courtroom. It was a tiny, mundane thing, a piece of rubber and porcelain that had sat in a woman's mouth while she drank tea, complained about the weather, argued over business contracts. It had survived the acid that was supposed to erase her completely. Webb watched the jury. He saw the moment the spell broke. The fascination in their eyes hardened into something colder, more durable. They were no longer looking at a vampire. They were looking at a woman's false teeth, recovered from a vat of poison. The metaphysical ramblings of the prisoner evaporated, leaving behind the stark, ugly truth of a murder committed for profit. The supernatural could not explain a denture plate. Only a killer trying to hide a body could do that. It is the upper plate of Mrs. Constance Durand-Deacon, Simpson stated, his voice flat, final. Identified by her dentist, Mr. Price, who noted a specific repair to the clasp performed only 3 weeks before her disappearance. Haigh leaned forward, his hands gripping the rail until his knuckles turned white. That proves nothing, he snapped, his voice losing its melodic quality, becoming shrill. Anyone could have lost those. She could have thrown them away. In a locked shed, Simpson countered, finally turning to face the accused. Surrounded by sludge that matches the tissue type of the owner, I think not, Mr. Haigh, for chemistry does not lie nor does it fantasize, it simply remains. The silence that followed was not the hushed awe of the earlier testimony, it was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a door slamming shut. Webb exhaled, a long, slow breath he felt he had been holding since the investigation began. The tension in his shoulders eased, replaced by a grim satisfaction. They had won, not with blood, not with confessions, but with fat and bone and a piece of plastic. The ledger was balancing itself, one chemical fact at a time. When the court rose for the morning recess, the crowd surged towards the doors, a chaotic tide of reporters and onlookers desperate for a quote. Webb pushed against the flow, moving towards the side corridor where the families were permitted to wait. He found Olive Durand-Deacon standing by a window, her back to the noise, staring out at the grey London sky. She looked smaller than he remembered, her coat hanging loosely on her frame, but there was a new stillness about her. "Mrs. Durand-Deacon," Webb said softly. She turned, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Did you hear, Detective Inspector? The teeth." "I heard," Webb replied. "It is conclusive." "She has a name again," Olive said, her voice trembling slightly, not with grief this time, but with a strange, fierce relief. Before today, she was just missing, a rumor, something he could twist into a story about vampires and magic. But gallstones, a denture plate, those are hers and they are real. "They are," Webb agreed. "The court will have no choice now." "It does not bring her back," Olive whispered, looking down at her gloved hands. "Nothing will do that. The acid took her body and the earth took her peace, but at least we know she did not just vanish into thin air. She was here, she existed, and he cannot take that away from us now." Webb nodded, unable to find words that would not sound cheap against the weight of her loss. He wanted to tell her that justice would be served, that Haigh would pay, but those words felt insufficient in the face of such absolute erasure. Instead, he offered a small, respectful bow. "The science has given her back her identity, Mrs. Durand-Deacon. That is something he could not dissolve." A bailiff appeared at the end of the corridor, ringing a small bell to signal the resumption of proceedings. "Court is reconvening," the man called out. Olive straightened her coat, taking a deep breath as if preparing to dive into cold water. "I must go back in. I must hear the rest." "Of course," Webb said. He watched her walk away, her steps firmer now, anchored by the cold, hard facts of the morning. He remained in the corridor for a moment longer, listening to the murmur of the crowd, returning to the courtroom, the shuffling of feet, the clearing of throats. The case was effectively over. The rest was just formality, the mechanical grinding of the legal machine towards its inevitable conclusion. Webb turned and walked back towards the courtroom door, his hand resting on the handle. He could hear the judge's voice booming inside, beginning the summation, dismissing the insanity plea with a sharp, logical precision that mirrored Simpson's testimony. "The defense of insanity," the judge was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the open door, "relies on the premise that the accused did not know the nature of his act, but a man who carefully forges signatures, who plans the acquisition of assets, and who attempts to conceal his crimes with industrial acid knows exactly what he is doing. The jury must consider the cold facts of the chemical evidence, not the fantastical delusions of the prisoner." Webb pushed the door open and stepped back into the gloom of the court, ready to witness the final sealing of the ledger. The air still smelled of wool and sweat, but the phantom scent of sulphur was gone, washed away by the undeniable clarity of the truth. Webb settled into the hard wooden bench, the varnish worn smooth by decades of anxious trousers. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light cutting through the high window, oblivious to the gravity of the proceedings below. The judge's voice rolled on, a steady baritone that filled the vaulted space without needing to rise in volume. "Consider the evidence," Mr. Justice Lawrence instructed, his gaze sweeping over the 12 men in the box. "You have heard testimony regarding the supernatural, vampirism, blood drinking, a thirst that could only be slaked by the living." Haigh sat perfectly still in the dock, his hands folded on the rail. He looked less like a man facing the gallows and more like a lecturer waiting for a question from a dull student. There was no tremor in his chin, no sweat on his brow, despite the stifling heat of the courtroom. "Yet," the judge continued, leaning forward slightly, "you have also seen Exhibit A, the denture plate, recovered from a sludge that chemical analysis confirms is human fat, adipocere." Webb shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes creaking softly against the floorboards. Beside him, Fabian leaned in, his voice a low murmur barely audible over the judge's cadence. "He looks bored, Albert," the chief superintendent whispered, not taking his eyes from the prisoner. "Does he not understand the position he is in?" "He understands," Webb replied, keeping his own voice flat, "for he just believes the story matters more than the facts. It always has. Stories hang men too, if told well enough." "Not today." Webb turned his attention back to the jury. He studied them not as a collective entity, but as individuals grappling with the weight of a decision that would end a life. The foreman, a stout man with a mustache trimmed to precision, stared at the denture plate sitting on the clerk's desk. It looked small, insignificant, a piece of pink plastic that weighed more than the confession spoken from the dock. One of the younger jurors, a clerk by the look of his hands, rubbed his thumb against his index finger, a nervous tick. He glanced at Haigh, then away, unable to hold the gaze of the man who claimed to drink blood. The skepticism Webb had seen earlier was gone. In its place sat a grim, settled certainty. They were no longer wondering if the magic was real. They were calculating the cost of the lie. "The defense suggests insanity," Mr. Justice Lawrence said, his tone sharpening. "But insanity does not forge signatures with such meticulous care. Insanity does not open bank accounts. Insanity does not purchase acid in bulk while ensuring the receipts are kept for business purposes." Haigh shifted then, a slight movement of his shoulders. He opened his mouth as if to object, to interject with some metaphysical correction, but closed it again. There was no point. The logic of the court was a wall he could not dissolve. Webb felt the tension in his neck unwind, a slow release of muscle that had been knotted since the first body was reported missing. He thought of Olive Durand-Deacon in the corridor, her gloved hands clasped tight. "She has a name again." The words echoed in his mind, quieter than the judge's voice but far more resonant. The science had done what the police could not. It had pulled Constance back from the void, not as a victim of a vampire, but as a woman murdered for her possessions. The distinction mattered. It mattered to the law, and it mattered to the dead. "You must decide," the judge concluded, sitting back in his high chair, "whether the accused knew the nature of his act. If you are satisfied that he did, then your duty is clear." The silence in the room was absolute. No coughing, no shuffling of papers. Even the reporters in the gallery had stopped scratching their pencils against their notebooks, waiting for the final directive. Webb watched Haigh's reflection in the polished wood of the dock. The man was staring at the judge, his eyes bright with a peculiar intensity. He did not look defeated. He looked like a man who believed the final chapter had yet to be written, that some twist of fate or logic would yet spare him. Webb knew better. The ledger was closing. "Take the prisoner down," the clerk announced, his voice cutting through the stillness. The warders moved in, stepping close to Haigh. One placed a hand on his elbow, guiding him to his feet. Haigh rose smoothly, adjusting his jacket as if preparing to leave for a business meeting rather than a cell. He glanced towards the public gallery, searching for something a face, a sign, a recognition. He found nothing. The rows of strangers stared back, their expressions blank. "Until tomorrow," Haigh said softly. It was not a plea, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of a man who believed time was something he could manipulate. The warders led him away, the heavy door of the dock clanging shut behind them. The sound echoed through the court, a final period at the end of a long, bloody sentence. Webb stood as the judge rose, the wood of the bench groaning under the shift in weight. Fabian remained seated for a moment, watching the empty dock. "Guilty," Fabian said. It was not a question. "Guilty," Webb confirmed. "And then?" "Then we wait for the sentence, then we wait for the rope." Fabian nodded, finally rising to his feet. He brushed a speck of dust from his lapel, a gesture of tidiness that seemed out of place in the aftermath of such ugliness. "Go home, Albert. You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I'll sleep when it's done." "It won't be done until he's in the ground." Webb didn't answer. He turned and walked towards the exit, joining the stream of people filing out into the corridor. The air outside was cooler, the grey London afternoon pressing against the high windows. He could hear the murmur of the crowd in the main hall, the speculation, the betting on how long the appeal would take. He pushed through the doors and stepped onto the pavement. The noise of the city hit him immediately, the rumble of buses, the shout of a newsboy, the distant drill of construction work. Life continuing, indifferent. Webb paused, lighting a cigarette with hands that finally stopped trembling, and though the smoke tasted bitter and harsh against the back of his throat, he inhaled deeply. He held it for a moment before exhaling into the damp air. The case was effectively over, for the evidence had held, and justice would be served. But as he walked towards the waiting police car, the image of the denture plate stayed with him. Small, pink, plastic, the only thing left of Constance Durand-Deacon. He opened the car door and slid into the back seat, the leather cold against his legs. "Back to the yard, sir?" the driver asked, looking in the rear-view mirror. "Yes," Webb said, "back to the yard." He leaned his head against the window, watching the city pass by. The buildings were scarred from the war, patched with brick and hope. They would stand, they would endure. But for the 6 people in Haigh's ledger, there would be no rebuilding. Only the acid and the earth and the quiet, chemical truth that remained. The engine turned over, a low thrum that vibrated through the chassis. Webb closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring the sentence. Tomorrow would bring the end. But tonight, there was only the drive and the smoke and the long, slow walk back to the station where the paperwork waited. Cold bit through the wool of his overcoat, finding the gaps in the weave where the moths had done their quiet work during the summer storage. Webb shifted his stance, boots scraping against the wet flagstones, and pressed his shoulder harder against the prison wall. The brickwork held the night's dampness like a sponge, seeping through the jacket and settling into the marrow of his spine until he wondered if the cold would ever leave him, if it had become a permanent resident alongside the memory of dissolved bone. Above, the sky hung low and grey, a ceiling of cloud that refused to break despite the calendar insisting it was August. No sun, no warmth, just the indifferent light of a London morning that cared nothing for justice or endings. Footsteps approached from the left, heavy and deliberate on the wet stone. Webb did not turn immediately. He knew the rhythm of that walk, the slight drag of the left foot that spoke of an old injury sustained in an East End alleyway 10 years prior. "Morning, Albert." Fabian stopped beside him, lighting a cigarette against the cupped warmth of his hands. The flare of the match illuminated the deep lines around his mouth, the exhaustion that mirrored Webb's own reflection in the shop windows they had passed on the way here. "Robert, any change?" "Still closed." Fabian exhaled, the smoke mingling with the mist before vanishing into the gloom. He looked up at the wall, at the blank face of the building that held the condemned man within its belly. Somewhere inside, a priest would be waiting. A last meal sat untouched on a tray. Haigh would be checking his watch, calculating the minutes remaining as if they were currency he could spend to buy more time. They say he asked for a steak, Fabian said, flicking ash onto the ground. Bloody nerve. He believes he's special. He believes he's clever. There's a difference. Webb reached into his pocket and withdrew his spectacles, wiping the condensation from the lenses with the frayed edge of his handkerchief. The world blurred into grey smudges, then sharpened as he pushed them back onto the bridge of his nose. The clarity brought no comfort. It only made the prison gates more distinct, the iron bars more solid, the reality of what was about to happen more absolute. Did Olive ring? Webb asked. Yesterday. She wants to know when the estate can be released. Tell her soon, now. I told her. Fabian paused, grinding the cigarette out under his heel before adding, she didn't sound relieved, Albert, just tired like us. Justice doesn't restore what was lost. No, it just stops the bleeding. A warder appeared at the gate, a dark silhouette against the lighter grey of the courtyard beyond. He held a folded flag in his hands, black cloth bundled tight. He did not look at Webb or Fabian. He looked at the flagpole, at the mechanism that would raise the signal to the crowd gathering further down the road, the vultures who wanted to smell the death even if they could not see it. Webb's hand twitched towards his pocket, seeking the comfort of a cigarette, but he stopped himself. Nicotine would not fix this. Nothing would. The investigation was over, the trial concluded, the appeals dismissed, yet the weight in his chest remained, a stone-swallowed hole that sat heavy in the gut. He had caught the killer. He had secured the evidence. He had watched the jury return the only verdict they could. And still the acid smell lingered in his memory, sweet and rotting, clinging to the back of the throat. No amount of mint or tobacco could scrub away. Look, Fabian said. The warder began to pull the rope. The black flag unfurled, catching the damp air, rising inch by inch until it snapped taut at the top of the pole. A signal, a period. The state had taken its pound of flesh. Webb watched the cloth flutter. He waited for the surge of satisfaction, the professional pride that should come with a case closed so neatly, so scientifically. It did not come. There was only the hollow release of tension, the deflating of a balloon that had been inflated to bursting point for months. The breath left his lungs in a long, slow stream that vanished into the mist. Done, Fabian said. Done, Webb echoed. He pushed himself away from the wall, the damp brick leaving a dark stain on the shoulder of his coat. His legs felt stiff, the joints protesting the sudden movement after standing still for so long. He needed to move. He needed to get back to the office, to the familiar scent of stale tobacco and coal dust that waited for him in Hampstead. The prison belonged to the dead now. The living had work to do. Cars around the corner, Fabian noted, gesturing with his chin. I'll walk. Albert, it's pouring. Let it rain. Webb set off down the street, his heels clicking against the wet stones to mark the rhythm of his departure, yet he did not look back at the flag. He needed no visual confirmation to know it hung there, a black mark against the sky that would remain until the sun went down. The ledger was closed, the names were accounted for. McSwan, the Hendersons, the Durand Deacons, Oliver, Heath, 6 lives extinguished, and only one taken in return. The arithmetic balanced. But as he turned the corner, away from the prison and towards the waiting vehicle, the taste of sulphur rose in his mouth again, unbidden and sharp. He swallowed it down. It would pass. It had to pass. He reached the car and opened the rear door, sliding onto the leather seat that felt cold and slick against his trousers. Where to, sir? The driver asked, leaning forward. Hampstead, Webb said. The office. The engine caught, shuddering once before settling into a low idle. Webb leaned his head against the window, watching the prison walls slide out of view as the car pulled away. The city rushed past, waking up, opening shops, sweeping steps, starting the day. They did not know the flag was up. They did not care. Life continued, indifferent and relentless, washing over the scars of the war and the crimes of men like Haigh without pausing to mourn. Webb closed his hand over the spectacles in his lap, feeling the metal warm against his palm. He would go back to the desk. He would file the report. He would sign the final forms that released the estate to Olive Deacon. And then, perhaps, he would sleep. But not yet. The car accelerated, merging into the flow of traffic on the Holloway Road. Webb watched the pedestrians blurring past, their faces indistinct in the rain-streaked glass. He wondered how many of them carried their own hidden ledgers, their own debts of blood and guilt that no court could ever adjudicate. "Sir," the driver prompted, noticing the silence stretching too long. "Drive," Webb said. The vehicle moved forward, leaving the black flag behind, disappearing into the grey throat of the city. The engine's shudder vibrated through the chassis, a mechanical tremor that traveled up Webb's spine and settled in the base of his skull. Rain streaked the windowpane, distorting the passing rows of terraced houses into smeared watercolors of brick red and soot gray, blurring the sharp edges of a city that refused to soften despite the peace. "Keep to the side streets if you can," Webb murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Less traffic." The driver nodded, a bobbing silhouette in the rearview mirror, and guided the vehicle away from the main artery of Holloway Road into the narrower veins of Islington. Here, the pace slowed. A milk cart rattled over cobblestones, the horse's hooves striking sparks that vanished instantly in the wet. A woman in a headscarf hauled a pram up a curb, her shoulders hunched against the drizzle, ignoring the black car as it crept past like a shark in shallow water. Webb watched her disappear into a doorway, wondering if she knew what had happened 5 miles away, if the rising of a black flag meant anything to a mother fighting the morning damp. Probably not. The world turned on its axis, regardless of justice served or denied. The car halted outside the Hampstead station, the brakes squealing a sharp protest against the wet tarmac. Webb opened the door before the engine fully died, stepping out onto the pavement where the smell of wet wool and exhaust fumes hit him, heavy and familiar. No sulphur here, just coal smoke and the faint, sweet rot of garbage waiting for collection. He walked inside, the warmth of the corridor wrapping around him like a stale blanket. The receptionist looked up from her ledger, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of his damp coat and the grey pallor of his face, but she said nothing. A nod sufficed. Professional silence was a currency they all spent freely. His office remained exactly as he had left it 3 days prior, a snapshot of suspended animation. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light cutting through the blinds, illuminating the stack of files on his desk that seemed to have grown in his absence, multiplying like cells in a culture. The ashtray held the stub of a cigarette he had crushed out before leaving for Pentonville, a fossilized remnant of a different version of himself. Webb sat down, the chair creaking under his weight, and pulled the top file towards him. The Deacon estate. Olive's name sat at the top of the page, typed in crisp black ink, a stark contrast to the chaotic scrawls and acid-stained notes that filled the preceding 100 pages. He picked up his fountain pen, uncapping it with a deliberate click that echoed in the quiet room. The nib hovered over the paper. He needed to write the date, August 1949. The month would end soon, slipping into September, bringing with it the turn of the leaves and the shortening of days, but here, in this room, time felt congealed, stuck in the amber of the investigation. "So," Webb jumped, the pen jerking to leave a stray ink blot on the margin. Fabian stood in the doorway, dripping wet, his hat clutched in one hand, water pooling on the linoleum at his feet. He looked exhausted, the lines around his mouth deeper than Webb remembered, etched by the same sleepless nights that had hollowed out his own cheeks. "I thought you went home," Webb said, recupping his pen. "I did," turned around at the corner. Fabian stepped inside, closing the door with a soft click that sealed them in together. "Couldn't sit still. Mary asked if you'd eaten. I told her I didn't know." "I haven't." "Tea then, or something stronger?" "Tea," Webb rubbed his eyes, the friction generating a brief warm heat behind his lids. "Strong, 2 sugars if the ration allows." Fabian moved to the small gas ring in the corner, striking a match that flared bright yellow before settling into a blue hiss. He filled the kettle from the tap, the water glugging into the metal vessel with a sound that seemed too loud, too domestic for the room where they had dissected the dissolution of human bodies. Olive rang again, Fabian said, his back to Webb as he waited for the water to boil. Sounded different, lighter perhaps, or just empty. The estate can be released now. I'm writing the confirmation. Good, Fabian turned, leaning against the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. She asked if there was anything left of Constance. Webb's hand froze on the file. The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible. What could he say? That there was fat in a drum, that gallstones had been sifted from sludge, that a few fragments of bone had been identified by a pathologist who looked as sick as the families felt. There is enough, Webb said finally, the words tasting like ash, enough for the law and enough for her to know. She doesn't want to know, Albert. She wants it to be untrue. Fabian sighed, a long, rattling sound that seemed to drain the energy from his frame. But we deal in what is, not what we wish for. The kettle whistled, a sharp, piercing note that shattered the moment. Fabian poured the water, the steam rising in a thick plume that momentarily obscured his face, making him look like a ghost emerging from the fog. He handed Webb a chipped mug, the heat radiating through the ceramic, warming Webb's cold fingers. Drink, Fabian commanded gently, his voice soft yet firm as he added that the paperwork must be finished immediately since they simply could not leave it half-done. Webb took a sip, the tea scalding his tongue, bitter and strong. It grounded him, pulling his mind back from the precipice of memory where the smell of vinegar and death still lingered, waiting to pull him under. He set the mug down and picked up the pen again. Date 10th August 1949. Status: execution carried out. Estate cleared for release. The ink flowed smoothly, black and permanent. Each letter was a brick in a wall he was building between himself and the Crawley shed, between the living and the dissolved. He signed his name at the bottom, the loop of the W tight and controlled, a small act of order in a chaotic world. There, he said, blowing on the wet ink to dry it. It's done. Fabian nodded, finishing his tea in 3 long gulps. I'll take it to the typist. She can have the letters out by post this afternoon. Thank you, Robert. Don't thank me, just go home, Albert, and sleep. Fabian gathered the file, tucking it under his arm as he added, shut the door behind you and don't open it until morning. The city will still be there tomorrow, but the dead won't go anywhere. Webb watched him leave, the door clicking shut once more. Silence rushed back in to fill the void, but it felt different now, less oppressive. The weight on his chest had shifted, not gone, but moved to a place where he could carry it. He stood up, his joints popping in protest, and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had eased to a mist, softening the outlines of the buildings across the street. A bus rumbled past, its headlights cutting through the gloom, carrying passengers home to dinners prepared with rationed meat and powdered egg. Normal life, mundane survival. Webb picked up his hat and coat, shaking the damp from the fabric before putting them on. He turned off the light, plunging the office into shadow, and walked out into the corridor. His footsteps echoed on the tiles, a solitary rhythm marking his departure. Down the stairs and out onto the street, the air smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust, clean compared to the cloying sweetness of the acid bath that had haunted his dreams for months. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the smoggy London air, and began to walk. He did not head for the bus stop. He would walk home. The movement felt necessary, a physical assertion that he was still here, still moving, still part of the flow of the city. He turned the corner, leaving the station behind, and merged into the stream of pedestrians hurrying through the dusk. As he walked, the taste of sulphur rose in his mouth one last time, sharp and unbidden, a final ghost of the case. He swallowed it down hard and kept walking. It would fade, eventually. The streetlights flickered on above him, casting long, wavering shadows on the pavement, guiding him home through the gathering dark. The Sulphur Ledger is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. The Acid Bath Murderer, a terrifying true story of one of the worst British serial killers, Internet Archive. The Acid Bath Murders, the trials and liquidations of George Haigh, Internet Archive. Crimes and Victims, Internet Archive. John Haigh. Georges Alexander Sarret. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.